Part 1. The Habsburgs and the Spark of Conflict. Hey guys, settle in. Dim the lights, grab that lukewarm chamomile, and let the gentle drone of history lull you into a state of semi-awareness. Tonight, we're not chasing dramatic battles or grand pronouncements. Oh no, tonight we're easing into the subtle, often ridiculous ways that personal quirks and family trees manage to set entire continents ablaze. We're going to meander through the peculiar landscape of Habsburg dynastic maneuvering, focusing on the sort of familial entanglement that only centuries of marrying your cousins and then your cousins' cousins can truly achieve. So, let's begin, shall we, with a slow drift into the slightly bewildering world of how one very particular family managed to kick off a rather significant European conflict. Our story, or rather, our gentle amble, begins, as so many good stories do, with an archduke. But not just any archduke. We're talking about Ferdinand II, Archduke of Inner Austria. Now, Ferdinand was born in 1578, which means he arrived on the scene right in the thick of things, religiously speaking. Europe was, shall we say, a bit testy when it came to matters of faith. The Protestant Reformation had been making waves, big, splashy, often violent waves, for decades by this point. And the Habsburgs? Well, they were the undisputed champions of Catholicism, like really Catholic, devout to the point of obsession, you might say, which, as we'll see, can be a bit of a problem when your subjects decide they prefer a different flavor of Christianity. Ferdinand himself was educated by the Jesuits because of course he was. The Jesuits were, at this time, essentially the Habsburgs' go-to guys for instilling unwavering Catholic orthodoxy into their young princes. And they did a rather thorough job with Ferdinand. He emerged from his education not just Catholic, but a zealous Catholic, the kind of Catholic who, upon inheriting his territories, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, for those playing along at home, decided that religious tolerance was, frankly, overrated. Now, these particular Habsburg lands had seen a fair bit of Protestantism take root. The local nobility, the burghers in the towns, even some of the peasants, had drifted away from the old faith. But Ferdinand, fresh from his Jesuit schooling and brimming with counter-Reformation fervor, was having precisely none of it. He saw it as his sacred duty, divinely ordained and all that, to restore Catholicism to its rightful, singular dominance. And how did he propose to do this? With a gentle nudge, perhaps? A polite suggestion? Not quite. Ferdinand launched what became known as the Counter-Reformation in Inner Austria. This wasn't some subtle theological debate. This was, to put it mildly, a rather forceful campaign. Protestant preachers were expelled, their churches were closed, and anyone holding a public office was required to be Catholic. If you weren't Catholic, well, you could either convert or pack your bags. It was a clear-cut choice, really, and, perhaps not surprisingly, not everyone was thrilled with this sudden shift in religious policy. The Protestants in his lands, who had grown accustomed to a certain degree of freedom, found themselves in a rather uncomfortable position. It was all very effective from Ferdinand's perspective, but it certainly stoked the fires of resentment. Meanwhile, in a different branch of the ever-expanding Habsburg family tree, things were getting, well, complicated. See, the Habsburgs had this habit of dividing up their vast territories amongst various family members. It made sense, in a way, to have different cousins and uncles ruling different bits, but it also meant that the family itself became a rather complex web of overlapping jurisdictions and, occasionally, competing ambitions. The main branch, the one holding the imperial title, the Holy Roman Emperor, was currently headed by Emperor Rudolf II. Now, Rudolf was, to put it politely, an eccentric. He was far more interested in alchemy, astrology, and collecting art than he was in the tedious business of actually governing an empire.
He spent most of his time locked away in Prague Castle, surrounded by his esoteric collections, while the state affairs drifted. This was, as you can imagine, not ideal for maintaining stability in an empire already grappling with religious divisions and increasingly assertive princes. Rudolf had no legitimate children, which, for a ruling dynasty, is always a bit of a problem. His brothers, Matthias, Maximilian, and Albert, were next in line, and they were, shall we say, rather less inclined to spend their days communing with the stars. They wanted power, real power, the kind that involves actual decisions and not just deciphering ancient texts. So, as Rudolf retreated further into his private world of arcana, his brothers began to, quietly and then not so quietly, maneuver for control. Matthias, the eldest of the surviving brothers, was the most ambitious. He essentially staged a slow-motion coup against Rudolf. Over several years, Matthias managed to peel away territories and loyalties from his increasingly isolated imperial brother. First, he got himself recognized as head of the Habsburg family. Then, he secured control over Austria. Finally, in 1608, he forced Rudolf to cede the Kingdom of Hungary and the Archduchy of Austria to himself. Rudolf was left with just Bohemia and the title of Holy Roman Emperor, a title that was, at this point, feeling rather hollow. This family squabble, while deeply personal, had wider implications. It destabilized the Habsburg grip on power and emboldened various factions within the empire. The Protestant estates, seeing the imperial family in disarray, started to press for more concessions, more guarantees for their religious freedoms. It was a messy situation, a slow-burning fuse, really, and it was all fueled by Rudolf's peculiar habits and his brother's understandable desire for a bit more say in things. So, by the time Rudolf finally shuffled off this mortal coil in 1612, Matthias was ready to step into his shoes as emperor. And he did. Emperor Matthias. But Matthias, bless his heart, was old and childless himself, which, again, for a ruling dynasty, is a recurring plot point that tends to lead to trouble. The question of succession was still very much open, and this is where our zealous Archduke Ferdinand II comes back into the picture. You see, even though Matthias was emperor, the succession plan had already been cooking for a while. The other Habsburgs, looking at Matthias's lack of heirs, had decided that Ferdinand, our devout counter-Reformation enthusiast, was the best candidate to succeed him. He was, after all, a Habsburg, and a very Catholic one at that. In their eyes, he was the strong, steady hand needed to guide the empire, especially in these turbulent religious times. So, in 1617, Matthias, under pressure from his family, reluctantly accepted Ferdinand as his designated successor to the Bohemian and Hungarian crowns. And then, crucially, he started trying to get the various electors of the Holy Roman Empire to agree with Ferdinand as the next emperor. This, my friends, was a move that, in hindsight, could be described as pouring gasoline on a flickering flame. Because Ferdinand, as we've already established, was not known for his conciliatory nature when it came to Protestants. And Bohemia, particularly the Kingdom of Bohemia, was a hotbed of Protestant sentiment. The Bohemian estates, the local assembly of nobles, had enjoyed a fair degree of religious freedom under Rudolf II, who, for all his eccentricities, had been relatively hands-off in matters of religion. They had even managed to extract a letter of majesty from Rudolf in 1609, which guaranteed religious liberty to Protestants in Bohemia. It was a significant document, a source of great pride and security for the Protestant Bohemians. So, when word started trickling down that Ferdinand, the man who had so thoroughly purged Protestantism from his own lands in Inner Austria, was slated to become their next king, the Bohemians were, shall we say, a tad tad nervous. More than a tad, actually. They were deeply, profoundly apprehensive. They saw him as a direct threat to their hard-won religious freedoms and their autonomy. And they had good reason to. Ferdinand hadn't suddenly become a champion of religious diversity. His views were as rigid as ever. So, the stage was set.
So, we left off with 3 imperial officials taking a rather undignified yet miraculously non-fatal plunge from a window in Prague Castle. This defenestration of Prague in May 1618 wasn't just a physical toss, it was the Bohemians hurling years of resentment right back at the Habsburgs. The smell of manure and rebellion was thick in the air. The Bohemian estates, realizing they'd just crossed the point of no return, you can't really apologize for throwing the king's representatives out of a window and expect a simple slap on the wrist, quickly moved to consolidate their position. They expelled the Jesuits from Bohemia, because why not double down on the anti-Habsburg, anti-Catholic sentiment? And they set up a government of 30 directors to run the country, essentially declaring their independence from the extremely Catholic and now extremely offended Archduke Ferdinand. Ferdinand, meanwhile, was not amused. To say he was outraged would be an understatement. He saw this as not just a political rebellion, but a personal insult and a sacrilege against the true faith. His reaction was exactly what you'd expect from a man whose entire education and worldview had been shaped by the most zealous elements of the Counter-Reformation: immediate, absolute suppression. However, the current emperor, Matthias, was still technically in charge, and he was old, sickly, and utterly exhausted by the whole family drama. He tried to handle the situation with some measure of restraint, or at least a distinct lack of zeal. But Matthias was barely hanging on. When he finally passed away, in March 1619, the path was cleared for Ferdinand to ascend to the imperial title he had coveted and schemed for. And so Ferdinand II, the man who had been thoroughly rejected by the Bohemians, now became Holy Roman Emperor. This was, shall we say, a bit of a predicament for the Bohemians. They had rebelled against him as their future king. Now he was their actual emperor, holding the most prestigious, if somewhat politically fragmented, title in Europe. The Bohemian estates were faced with a clear choice: reconcile with Ferdinand and hope for the best, or find an alternative. Being Protestant nobles who had just launched his officials onto a dung heap, they went for the latter. They formally declared the throne of Bohemia vacant and began the search for a new, suitably Protestant and sufficiently powerful monarch. Their choice fell upon a young man named Frederick V, Elector Palatine. Now, Frederick was a prominent figure for several reasons. He was one of the senior princes of the Holy Roman Empire, a member of the powerful Electoral College, and a staunch Calvinist. Crucially, he was also the son-in-law of James I of England, which the Bohemians hoped would bring the considerable wealth and military power of the English crown into their little rebellion. Because why aim for a small war when you can drag an entire continent into your family squabble? Frederick, bless his 23-year-old heart, was flattered, eager, and perhaps a bit naive about the actual danger involved. He accepted the Bohemian crown, packed his bags, and moved to Prague. He was crowned in November 1919. This was a direct, explicit slap in the face to Ferdinand II. By electing Frederick, the Bohemians had essentially thumbed their noses at the foundational principle of Habsburg dynastic succession. Frederick's acceptance of the crown was a catastrophic miscalculation. It turned a local internal Habsburg rebellion into a Europe-wide religious and dynastic crisis. Ferdinand II didn't just see this as insolence, he saw it as an existential threat to his authority and to the Catholic faith itself. He now had a usurper on one of his most important thrones, a Protestant usurper at that, backed, in theory, by major Protestant powers. Ferdinand II was not the kind of man to hesitate when faced with what he perceived as a divine purpose. While Frederick was busy setting up court in Prague, perhaps contemplating how best to run his newly acquired kingdom, Ferdinand was leveraging every connection, every marriage treaty, and every historical alliance he possessed. He appealed to his Spanish Habsburg cousins, the most powerful Catholic monarchy in Europe, who, of course, were happy to lend their weight to the cause. Spain was always keen to help consolidate Catholic power and curb the influence of Protestants anywhere, especially when it involved supporting the senior branch of their own family. More critically, he appealed to Maximilian I, Duke of Bavaria. Maximilian was another fervent Catholic, a powerful prince, and, quite importantly, the head of the Catholic League, a military alliance of Catholic states within the empire. Maximilian was promised the Palatine's electoral dignity, Frederick's right to vote for the Holy Roman Emperor, as a reward for his help, a nice, tidy, and extremely tempting incentive to get him involved. So, while the Bohemians were relying on the hypothetical support of the English King James I, who predictably ended up being far more interested in diplomatic maneuvering than actual military aid for his son-in-law, Ferdinand was building a very real, very zealous, and very well-funded army. The stage was now set for the showdown. It's hard not to feel a slight, weary pity for poor Frederick V. He was an idealist thrust onto a throne he wasn't quite ready for, relying on promises that never materialized. He was known as the Winter King because, rather ironically, his reign in Bohemia lasted barely a season. In the autumn of 1620, the armies of Ferdinand II, largely composed of the forces of the Catholic League under the command of Johann Serclaes, the Count of Tilly, marched toward Bohemia. This was an army of conviction, fueled by Ferdinand's unwavering vision of a unified Catholic empire. The climax came swiftly, a gentle yet decisive historical nudge at the Battle of White Mountain, Bila Hora, on November 8, 1620, just outside Prague. The battle itself was frankly a disaster for the Bohemian forces. It was a short, sharp, and utterly conclusive rout. The professional troops of the Catholic League, well led by Tilly, simply overwhelmed the less cohesive, less experienced Bohemian army. Frederick, the unfortunate Winter King, barely lasted a year on his new throne. On hearing of the crushing defeat, he fled Prague almost immediately, earning him the rather pathetic title of the king who ran away. He and his family went into exile and never to rule in Bohemia again. The English support he so desperately needed remained, as always, just a polite diplomatic promise. For Ferdinand II, the victory was total and complete. The Bohemian revolt had been absolutely crushed. The consequences were brutal and immediate, marking the true beginning of the longer, far more devastating conflict to come. Ferdinand wasted no time in exacting his revenge and cementing his authority. This wasn't going to be a simple hand slap and a promise to be good. Oh no, this was the moment for Ferdinand to demonstrate with uncompromising zeal the price of opposing a divinely ordained Habsburg emperor. The repression was swift and merciless. The leaders of the rebellion, who hadn't managed to flee, were rounded up. On June 21st, 27 Bohemian nobles and burghers, the most prominent figures of the Protestant-led opposition, were publicly executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their heads were displayed on spikes on the Charles Bridge, a grim and rather effective piece of public messaging that said, "Do not mess with Ferdinand." Ferdinand also immediately revoked the Letter of Majesty, the very document that had guaranteed religious freedom to the Bohemians for over a decade. He launched a ruthless campaign of re-Catholicization across Bohemia. Protestant preachers were expelled, Protestant worship was forbidden, and thousands of Protestant nobles and burghers and intellectuals were forced to choose between conversion to Catholicism or exile. The result was a mass exodus of some of the most industrious and educated people from Bohemia, permanently shifting the country's religious and social landscape. The Kingdom of Bohemia, which had been semi-autonomous, was essentially annexed, and its traditional rights were curtailed. It became a hereditary domain of the Habsburgs, with Ferdinand firmly in charge. The defeat of the Bohemian Revolt was a spectacular triumph for Ferdinand II. It secured his authority, it re-established Catholic dominance in a major imperial territory, and it avenged the humiliation of the defenestration of Prague. He had successfully quelled the initial spark of conflict. But here is the great irony, the gentle, sleepy tragedy of it all. By acting with such uncompromising zeal, by crushing the revolt so thoroughly and ruthlessly, Ferdinand II didn't end the conflict. He merely broadened its scope and deepened its intensity. He had just taken a localized family dispute and a regional revolt, wrapped it up in a package of religious fanaticism and dynastic pride, and handed it to the rest of Europe. The dispossessed Frederick V, now landless and titleless, still had powerful friends, or at least people who hated the Habsburgs more than they disliked Frederick.
Part 3. The Danish Interlude and the Rise of Wallenstein. We drift onward, quietly, from the ashes of the Bohemian Revolt. Ferdinand II, our zealous, unyielding Habsburg emperor, stood triumphant. He had crushed the internal rebellion, exiled the unfortunate Frederick V, the Winter King, and ensured that Bohemia was now firmly and uncompromisingly Catholic. He was feeling rather pleased with himself, having decisively demonstrated that challenging the Habsburgs was, shall we say, a poor career choice. But remember that pesky issue of the electoral dignity. Ferdinand, in his haste to reward Maximilian of Bavaria for his military aid and to punish Frederick V, had stripped the Palatine of his vote in the imperial election and handed it over to the Duke of Bavaria. This move, while strategically brilliant for cementing Catholic power, was a constitutional bombshell that resonated far beyond Bohemia. The remaining Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire were, quite understandably, furious. They viewed the emperor's arbitrary transfer of an electorate as a blatant violation of the empire's foundational laws. It looked suspiciously like Ferdinand was moving toward an absolute monarchy, undermining the traditional rights and privileges of the imperial estates. The fear was palpable. If Ferdinand could just decide to strip an elector of his title and give it to a Catholic ally, what was to stop him from doing the same to all the other Protestant princes? It was less about Frederick and more about a fundamental shift in the power balance. This resentment, coupled with the plight of the exiled Frederick V, kept the Protestant cause simmering. The conflict, having been neatly contained in Bohemia, began to leak out, spreading slowly across the German lands. It was the historical equivalent of a low-grade fever that just wouldn't break. This is where another key player glides onto our sleepy stage. Christian IV, King of Denmark and Norway, and, importantly, Duke of Holstein within the Holy Roman Empire. Christian IV was an interesting character. He was a capable ruler, a great builder, and an enthusiastic participant in European politics. He was also a staunch Protestant, and, perhaps most relevantly, he had ambitions. He was worried about Ferdinand's growing Catholic dominance encroaching on his own territories in northern Germany. Plus, he had a nice dynastic angle. He had family members who had lost bishoprics in northern Germany to the Habsburgs' counter-reformation efforts, and he saw himself as the natural, God-appointed protector of the Protestants in the region. So, egged on by the Protestant princes and, crucially, promised subsidies by England and the Dutch Republic, because in this war everyone was happy to fund someone else to fight the Habsburgs, Christian IV decided to intervene. In 1625, he marched his army into northern Germany. This marks the beginning of the Danish phase of the war.
The conflict was no longer a Habsburg internal affair. It was now an international war led by a foreign monarch directly challenging the Holy Roman Emperor. Ferdinand II, despite his recent successes, faced a new problem: funding this escalating war. His armies under the Catholic League's Count Tilly were excellent, but they required constant payment and the imperial treasury was perpetually stretched. War is expensive, especially when you're trying to suppress half a continent. Enter the most fascinating and perhaps most terrifying figure of this entire gentle nightmare: Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was an immensely wealthy Bohemian nobleman. Now, his backstory is crucial to understanding the weirdness of the era. He was originally a Protestant who converted to Catholicism, not necessarily out of deep religious conviction, but perhaps out of pure, cold-blooded ambition. He was a brilliant, if utterly ruthless, entrepreneur of war. Wallenstein offered Ferdinand a truly irresistible, if morally dubious, deal. Instead of relying on the struggling imperial treasury, Wallenstein offered to raise, equip, and supply a massive army on his own expense. The only catch? The army would sustain itself by living off the land, which is the polite historical term for ruthlessly plundering and extorting the territories they marched through. Ferdinand II, in desperate need of troops and cash, accepted. Because why not have an enormous, self-sustaining, privately funded army answerable only to a hyper-ambitious, enigmatic general? What could possibly go wrong? Wallenstein was given a vast swath of confiscated Bohemian land, the former estates of the defeated Protestant rebels, which made him stupendously rich and allowed him to bankroll his military enterprise. Within a few years, he had raised an army of tens of thousands, a massive force loyal only to him, their brilliant, idiosyncratic paymaster. The impact of Wallenstein and his army on the war was immediate and devastating. He was a brilliant strategist and administrator. While Tilly was dealing with Christian IV's main forces, Wallenstein's massive, mobile, and brutal army swept across northern Germany, cutting off the Danish supply lines and generally causing chaos and terror. In 1626, Wallenstein inflicted a crushing defeat on a Protestant army at the Battle of Dessau Bridge. Later that year, Tilly defeated Christian IV himself at the Battle of Lutter. The Danish king was forced into a desperate retreat. Wallenstein and his forces pursued him relentlessly, pushing the Danish army back through Germany, seizing territories like the Duchy of Mecklenburg, and eventually chasing Christian IV all the way back into Denmark itself. By 1629, Christian IV was exhausted and his kingdom was threatened. He was forced to sign the Treaty of Lübeck. In this treaty, Christian IV agreed to withdraw completely from the war, to cease all support for the Protestant cause in Germany, and, in return, he got his Danish territories back. The Danish phase was over, and it was another spectacular triumph for Ferdinand II. His position was now stronger than ever. The Protestant princes were utterly defeated, their international champion had been repelled, and the imperial military machine, led by Tilly and the terrifying efficiency of Wallenstein, was completely dominant across the empire. The goal of a unified, absolutely Catholic Holy Roman Empire seemed almost within reach for Ferdinand. And here, in his moment of greatest success, he made his final, deeply problematic move that ensured the war would continue. He did what he always did. He doubled down on his religious zealotry. In 1629, riding the high tide of victory, Ferdinand issued the Edictus of Restitution. This was arguably his most aggressive act of religious policy yet. The edictus essentially demanded that all ecclesiastical property, lands, bishoprics, monasteries that had been secularized, taken over by Protestants, since the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, be immediately restored to the Catholic Church. On the surface, it was about legality, restoring property rights that Ferdinand believed were unjustly seized. But in reality, it was a massive transfer of wealth and power from the Protestant princes and institutions back to the Catholic Church. It affected thousands of properties, threatened the livelihoods of countless Protestant nobles and officials, and completely upended the religious and political status quo established over 70 years prior. It was a massive, uncompromising assertion of imperial and Catholic authority. The edict horrified both Protestants and, crucially, a significant number of Catholic princes within the empire. The Catholic electors and princes, while happy to see the Protestants defeated, were deeply suspicious of the emperor's immense power. The edict, enforced by Wallenstein's brutal and self-sufficient army, looked like the emperor could now dictate policy without any regard for the rights of the electors, Catholic or Protestant. Ferdinand's uncompromising religious convictions, his belief that God was guiding his hand, blinded him to the political realities. His victory had been too complete, too assertive. He had not only crushed the Protestants, he had alienated his own Catholic allies and provided a perfect excuse for the next, far more dangerous foreign power to intervene. The stage was being quietly set for the next phase, where the conflict would escalate dramatically, drawing in the most formidable power in Northern Europe, and where the emperor would learn that having an immensely powerful, self-funded, and increasingly arrogant general like Wallenstein might just be a problem in of itself. We'll gently move now to the arrival of the Lion of the North.
Part 4. The Lion of the North and the Unraveling of Imperial Triumph. We pick up the thread of our gentle, winding history monologue right after Ferdinand II, in his moment of greatest, most zealous triumph, shot himself in the foot with the Edict of Restitution in 1629. He had just crushed the Danes and their Protestant allies, thanks largely to the military genius and private financing of Albrecht von Wallenstein. The empire was his, Catholicism was dominant, and life was good, if you were a Habsburg. But the edict, which mandated the return of all secularized church property, was an act of constitutional and religious overreach that terrified both Protestants and many Catholic princes, creating a perfect vacuum for the next major power to glide in. The stage was now set for the appearance of the man history would call the Lion of the North, Gustavus Adolphus, King of Sweden. Gustavus Adolphus was, frankly, a different caliber of opponent than the unfortunate Frederick V or the politically constrained Christian IV. He was a brilliant military innovator, a fiercely dedicated Lutheran, and the ruler of a rising Scandinavian power that was deeply concerned about Habsburg power encroaching on the Baltic Sea, the Swedish Lake, as they liked to think of it. Plus, the Swedish crown had its own historical grievances and financial interests in North German territories. So, in July 1630, Gustavus Adolphus landed a small but highly professional army on the coast of Pomerania. He announced his intervention not just as a political move, but as a crusade to defend German Protestant liberty. And he was immediately hailed by the remaining Protestant princes as a savior. Ferdinand II, sitting comfortably in Vienna, initially dismissed the Swedish king as a snow king who would soon melt away. Oh, how delightfully wrong he was. Meanwhile, a massive, rather significant family squabble was brewing on the Catholic side. Remember Wallenstein, the general who commanded the colossal, self-funded, ruthless imperial army?
Well, the Catholic princes, especially Maximilian of Bavaria and the other electors, had grown absolutely terrified of him. Wallenstein's army, sustained by plunder and accountable only to the general himself, had become a law unto itself. They were ravaging the German countryside, Catholic and Protestant lands alike, creating resentment everywhere they went. The princes felt that Wallenstein was threatening their sovereignty, and that his immense independent power was a greater danger to the empire structure than any Protestant resurgence. Furthermore, Wallenstein openly expressed contempt for the princes and was entirely too successful and too arrogant for their tastes. So, at the Regensburg Diet in 1630, the Catholic electors presented Ferdinand II with an ultimatum. They essentially said, it's him or us. They demanded that the emperor dismiss Wallenstein and drastically reduce the size of the imperial army. Ferdinand II faced an agonizing choice. On one hand, he had an immensely successful general who had just won him the war and whose army was the only reliable counter to the Snow King who had just landed. On the other, he risked alienating the powerful Catholic princes who were critical to the stability of the empire and who were needed to secure the election of his own son as the next king of the Romans. In a move that perfectly encapsulates the weird blend of dynastic politics, personal arrogance, and military necessity that defined this era, Ferdinand chose to appease the electors. He dismissed Wallenstein. Wallenstein, ever the pragmatist, retired to his estates, magnificent in his private wealth, waiting patiently for the inevitable call back. He had traded military security for political expediency and absolutely disastrous timing error. With Wallenstein gone and the imperial army significantly reduced, Gustavus Adolphus met the forces of the Catholic League, led by the veteran Count Tilly, at the Battle of Breitenfeld in September 1631. This was a turning point, a seismic shift in the war. Gustavus Adolphus, utilizing innovative tactics, highly disciplined troops, and excellent artillery coordination, the famed Swedish military machine, inflicted a devastating and highly publicized defeat on Tilly's army. Breitenfeld didn't just win a battle, it broke the psychological hold of the emperor. It demonstrated that the Habsburg Catholic League forces were not invincible. The Protestant princes, who had been cowed into submission, now flocked to the Swedish banner. The momentum had completely shifted. For the next year, Gustavus Adolphus marched his victorious army through Germany, essentially dismantling the gains Ferdinand II had made over the previous decade. He seized Bavaria, forcing Maximilian to flee, and threatened the Habsburg heartlands. The Snow King had become an unstoppable avalanche. Ferdinand II, utterly desperate, was forced to swallow his pride and beg the man he had scornfully dismissed just 2 years earlier to return. In late 1631, Ferdinand II reinstated Wallenstein with essentially unlimited power to raise a new army and conduct the war however he saw fit. Wallenstein, ever the shrewd dealer, accepted, but extracted terms that made him, for all intents and purposes, an independent ruler with the emperor's sanction. He was the one man who could possibly stop the Swedish onslaught. Wallenstein swiftly raised a massive new army and maneuvered brilliantly against Gustavus Adolphus. The final, decisive clash between these titanic, if deeply idiosyncratic figures, occurred at the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632. Lutzen was a brutal, bloody, and ultimately indecisive engagement. The imperial forces under Wallenstein were defeated, but the victory came at an enormous cost to the Swedes. Gustavus Adolphus was killed in the battle. The Lion of the North, the savior of the Protestants, was dead. The death of Gustavus Adolphus was a strange, grim piece of equilibrium.
It robbed the Protestants of their most inspirational and capable leader, but it didn't immediately destroy the Swedish war machine, which continued to fight under regents and capable generals. The conflict had lost its central protagonist, but gained a new, terrible momentum. And what about Wallenstein? He had saved the Habsburg monarchy from utter ruin, but his return was short-lived. His immense power, his independence, his vast personal fortune, and his increasingly enigmatic, almost regal behavior made him more frightening than ever to the electors and even to Ferdinand II himself. He began acting like a head of state, engaging in complex private negotiations with the enemy, seemingly pursuing his own aims of wealth and power rather than the emperor's. He had become too successful, too ambitious, and too essential, a fatal combination in the complex world of dynastic politics. Ferdinand II, paranoid and convinced that Wallenstein was plotting to betray him and seize the Bohemian throne for himself, a suspicion perhaps not entirely unfounded given Wallenstein's ambition, decided the risk was too great. In 1634, Ferdinand II issued a secret decree that declared Wallenstein a traitor and ordered his capture, dead or alive. It was a terrifying, decisive action against the man who had twice saved his crown. Wallenstein, having retreated to Bohemia, was assassinated by a small group of his own officers who had been promised imperial favor in rather a dramatic, messy fashion at Eger Castle. The assassination of Wallenstein in 1634 marks the final, gentle drift away from the central Habsburg drama and into the full, chaotic international mess of the war. Ferdinand II had eliminated his greatest general, his most successful ally, and his most terrifying internal threat, all in the space of 4 years. He was left with an empire financially ruined, militarily drained, and politically fractured. Ferdinand II himself, the man whose zealous personal convictions and dynastic ambition had lit the fuse for this catastrophic conflict, passed away quietly in 1637. He died believing, to the very end, that he was God's chosen instrument, that his ruthless recatholicization efforts had been divinely ordained, and that his cause was righteous. He left behind a legacy that was, in one word, catastrophic. He had achieved his personal goals. His son became emperor, the Habsburgs retained their crowns, and Bohemia was brutally recatholicized. But the price was the utter devastation of the Holy Roman Empire. The war which he had sparked and then failed to contain dragged on for another 11 years, morphing from a dynastic religious struggle into a